Welcome to Chapter 27, Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply. This chapter takes off from the previous chapter, Chapter 26, which looked at the circular flow between income and expenditures and developed a model that employed the multiplier. And so when we were looking at that multiplier effect, meaning that small changes in autonomous spending can lead to a ripple effect and a magnifying effect to overall GDP as as a business spends and then the money goes into the pockets of into a consumer, and consumer takes that money and they spend a proportion of it, and then person who obtains that money obtains a portion of it and continues right down, and we have ultimately a multiplier effect. So in that assumption, in those calculations, we assume that prices were fixed. And then in this chapter, we're going to relax that assumption. So what we're going to see is that changes in prices can now influence changes in real GDP. Okay? Not only that, but we're also going to see that changes in real GDP affect changes in prices. And so here we have a circular relationship between changing prices and real GDP. And so our ultimate goal using these aggregate supply and aggregate demand equations and models is that what we want to do is we want to explain, going back to what we looked at last chapter, short-run deviations from long-run potential. So here's long-run potential GDP, this nice trend. That trend is due to population growth and labor productivity, and that for whatever reason there are deviations from the trend. We go into recessions, we come out of recessions, we go into booms. We can use this aggregate supply and aggregate demand model to better explain how we fall into a recession, and then how the economy can be corrected and move back to its long-run equilibrium. Not only how we can maneuver it, but how it on its own can, through changing prices, has a tendency to snap back. It may be a little longer than what we'd like, but the economy by itself can snap back, and changing prices is part of the explanation. So we're going to dig into the aggregate demand curve, and just to give you an outline quickly of where we're going here, we're going to look at the aggregate demand curve individually, then we're going to look at the aggregate supply curve individually, and then we're going to combine the two to do our analysis. So that's where we're going in this chapter, rough outline. So we want to look at the aggregate demand curve. We know the aggregate demand curve, you've seen this before, is downward sloping. So here's AD, and here's real GDP, and here's price, aggregate price index, could be the GDP price deflator, which is just really capturing inflation for final goods and services. And so here's aggregate demand, and you can think of this as being C plus I plus G plus net exports. So we have all those components in at this point, and so that's the aggregate demand curve. Now we have to look at what, explain why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. And the point of this is that the reason for the downward sloping aggregate demand curve is not the same reason as the downward sloping demand curve for an individual good or service. The demand curve for an individual good or service was downward sloping. Okay? So here we had the quantity of a particular good or service. Here we had the price of a particular good or service, and the demand curve was downward sloping. If you recall why that was, think about it. You slid down this demand curve, for example, when you dropped the price, right? And all you did was change price. You slid down this demand curve. Quantity increased. Why did quantity increase? Because, well, the good is now cheaper. It's cheaper relative to other goods and services, and so there's a substitution effect going on there. You substitute out of those relatively more expensive goods and services, and you substitute and you move into this particular good. And it's consistent with the optimal consumption bundle that we looked at. So if you had, for example, if this was good X here, this was good X, so we had the marginal utility of X over the price of X, and we set that equal, say, to another good, Y, and that marginal benefit to marginal cost relationship. So here's the optimal consumption bundle. So what happens is when the price drops of X, this whole fraction goes up. So this becomes bigger. This area, this side of the equation becomes bigger, and it becomes bigger, you're going to want to consume more of X, which is what we see here. Okay, so in order to, so you want to consume more of X, what's to make this, end up making this equal, get this back to an equal sign. So you end up consuming more to bring the marginal utility down. Remember that story? So we basically had total utility here, right? And we had quantity here. So we had a utility function that looked like this, and then we had a marginal utility function that looked like this. Remember the old marginal utility function? And so if you want to consume more of X because it's cheaper, then you're going to slide down this marginal utility curve, and you're going to have less marginal utility. So that lower marginal utility will bring this side down. So that's a long-winded story, basically a review of what we did with individual goods and services. Okay, this story is not the story that's behind the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve is downward sloping for two reasons. One has to do with the wealth effect, and it's the wealth effect of a change in aggregate price level. And so your textbook is very careful when it bolds. For example, it bolds the concept of a wealth effect. It'll say the wealth effect of a change, a change in the aggregate price level. Okay, it's telling you that, and it's clarifying that this is a wealth effect due to a change in the aggregate price level, because there's all sorts of other wealth effects out there in economics. For example, if the stock market booms for a long period of time, there's a wealth effect because people end up feeling wealthier and they end up consuming more, all else being equal. And if there's also a real estate wealth effect, if the real estate market does quite well, if people feel more optimistic, they end up spending more. Okay, that's not here. This is a wealth effect due to a change in price level. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you have a certain amount of money in the bank, so to speak, or saved up, and the price level falls, so the aggregate price level falls, you are now more wealthy. And so if you're going to feel more wealthy, you will be more wealthy, because your wealth is now going to be able to buy a lot more goods and services if the price level is lower. So when prices fall, aggregate demand is going to go up. So you're going to run along this. So when aggregate prices change, you're moving along this, and it's going to be an increase in quantity from a change in a drop in price, something like that. Okay, that's the first effect that goes on. The second effect is the interest rate effect. Okay, and so this is the interest rate effect of a change in the aggregate price level. And again, your text is clear that to bold not just the interest rate effect, because there's a bunch of different interest rate effects. It could be interest rate effects due to change in monetary policy, for example. So this is an interest rate effect due to a change in the aggregate price level. And so what happens is, when the price level falls, the demand for money that people want to hold drops. And so I'm going to give you a graph that's a little bit out of turn. It shows up later, but it's an important graph. Your textbook talks through this in this chapter, but it hasn't prepared you yet for it, because it'll show up in a later chapter and when we talk about the Fed. So here we have the interest rate, and here we have quantity of money, basically here. We're going to assume, and we always assume, and you'll see this later on, that the money supply is fixed from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve fixes the money supply. It's independent of what the interest rate is. So it's just drawn as a straight line up. So it's just anchored there as a certain money supply. There's a money demand. And so for now, the money demand curve, you can think of it as people holding money, households holding money for convenience purposes and the ability to do transactions. And so they're holding money, and money I mean by money that's not only in their pocket, that's in cash registers, but it's also in checking accounts. That's actually defined as money. Okay? So what happens is when the price level falls, people don't need to hold as much money because prices have dropped. They don't need to hold as much money. Then the money demand curve drops down. And so interest rates, equilibrium interest rates, end up falling from 0.1 here down to 0.2. And so when interest rates fall, right, what that leads is to an increase of investment. So what happens is the aggregate price level falls. That causes interest rates to fall, and that leads to an increase in investment because now it's cheaper for businesses to expand and invest in projects and product lines. So that's the story there. So that's the effect of the interest rate effect on aggregate demand. So what we have here is we have recall we have the aggregate planned expenditures that equals C plus I. And so now I'm telling you that, look, there is the interest rate effect is driving up I. It can also drive up consumption. For example, consumption of durable goods and services, things that you might want to buy on credit. And so when drop in R is certainly going to hit I. It can hit consumption. And then you have the wealth effect, which basically says, look, when prices fall, you feel wealthier. When you feel wealthier, then what's that mean? That means A plus your marginal propensity to consume times your disposable income. This A is going to shoot up, and so your autonomous consumption will shoot up, all reinforcing these other effects so that your aggregate expenditures increase. And so going back to the last chapter, what you have is this story going on. You have here real GDP again. You have the 45-degree line, and here you have planned aggregate expenditures, and we have here AEP 1, which means planned aggregate expenditures 1, and then we have a boost, an increase in consumption up, and I up causes planned aggregate expenditures to go from 1 to 2. And so we start from here, equilibrium point 1, remember, because this is the 45-degree line where production equals spending. And so we go from this equilibrium to this new equilibrium. Slide up here to the new equilibrium, E2. Okay? Notice the multiplier effect. Okay? And so now what's happening is this is what we learned in chapter 2, and we just said, look, a drop in prices causes aggregate expenditures to go up. Remember, last chapter we basically said prices were fixed. Now we just relaxed that assumption, bring in some more concepts, and we said, look, a drop in price increases planned aggregate expenditures. Now what we want to do is let's see if I can get this. I think I'm going to redraw it a little smaller, and I'm going to stack my graphs up now. So I'm just going to redo what I just had there, and I'm going to stack these graphs, and I can stack them because they have the same x-axis here, real GDP. So here's the aggregate price level, here's the aggregate demand curve, here is AEP P1, and here is AEP2, equilibrium 1, equilibrium 2. So I need a new pen. That was starting to die out on me. So this equilibrium here, first equilibrium, comes down, and you can say, look, right here is the equilibrium, equilibrium 1. Okay, it's at a certain price level. So when we dropped the price level and we saw that consumption went up and investment went up due to the wealth effect and the interest rate effect, we shot up. We had the multiplier effect. So this is the multiplier effect because it doesn't show up very well here, but this is bigger than the change we have in consumption and investment. So we come down and we slide down the aggregate demand curve because prices went down, as we talked about. Prices went from P1 to P2. So there you have it, the linking up so what we're seeing here is an aggregate demand curve whose foundation and underpinnings are based on this Keynesian model, sometimes called, this graph being called sometimes the Keynesian cross model. And so there we have it. Where we have it, the multiplier is underneath the aggregate demand curve. It's there, it's lurking in the background. So now what we want to do is ask ourselves, what causes shifts in the aggregate demand curve? And so here, let's redraw the aggregate demand curve. What's going to cause aggregate demand curve to shift up or down? That's important because that's what we're going to try to do with policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy. It's going to try to shift that aggregate demand curve. So there's several things, and they're all important. One would be you shift the aggregate demand curve because of shifts in changes in expectations. Expectations of what? Expectations of future disposable income, YD, future disposable, and you should be future, not current disposable, change in expectations of future disposable income, and wealth. So basically what we're saying is if you expect your disposable income to increase next year, you're probably going to ramp up your consumption now rather than wait till you actually see it. If your wealth is expected to go up, you're going to, in the future, and you're sure of it, then you're going to start spending now. And so that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve. So if your wealth goes up, your aggregate demand curve is going to go up. Disposable income goes up. It's going to shift in this direction, up and to the right, up and to the right. Okay. There's also current wealth will also affect this. Not current disposable income. Current disposable income is already embedded in the aggregate demand curve. It's so it's we're looking here at current wealth, but not current disposable income. Current wealth. So if you suddenly become wealthy now, then you're going to increase your aggregate demand curve. If somehow you lose a lot of wealth, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift in. Okay. The other thing is it's the stock of physical capital, which we saw in the last chapter around investment. So really what this is saying is what is your stock of physical capital? If your stock of physical capital is high, meaning basically what it's saying is you have a lot of slack in your business, so you have a lot of physical capital that's available, and you're not using it all. Your utilization is low. So the slack has to do with if businesses see higher future real GDP growth, so future GDP growth is going to be higher. Remember the accelerator effect from the previous chapter? Then businesses are going to want to ramp up their investment if they know that they're going to have to produce more in the future. But if they have a lot of slack in their business and they have a lot of unused investment, idle property, plant, and equipment, then that's going to have an effect on aggregate demand. So they'll see a ramp up in GDP coming up in the future, but they're not going to increase their investment because they already have the investment in place. So the stock of physical capital, or I like to call it the amount of slack that's in businesses, has an effect on aggregate demand. Fourth thing, and this is very important, we have a whole chapter on it, and that's fiscal policy. Fiscal policy will shift mainly through government expenditures. That's the direct effect, because remember, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports, and so federal government can directly change G, increase G. They increase G, it's going to shift the demand curve out, or if they decrease it, shift it in. Okay. The other way is it's more indirect, and that's by changing T, taxes. So you can change taxes, and you can see that impact, for example, on the marginal propensity to consume. And obviously, the more you get taxed, remember the old Laffer curve that I showed you. If you have a tax rate here, starts at 0, goes all the way up to 100%. Here's your tax rate. And this is your total revenue collected for the government through taxes. So when you have a 0 tax rate, the government collects no revenue. If you have a 100% tax rate, the government collects no revenue because nobody wants to work, because every penny they earn goes to the government. There's some optimal point here for maximizing the total revenue. There's an optimal tax rate there. So changing the tax rate will affect the total revenue of the country, and it'll have obviously effects on consumption. It could have effects on investment, and it could actually have, tariffs and all could have effects on imports and exports. The fifth item is monetary policy, and so we have 2 chapters devoted to that. That's a bit more complicated. And so that's where the Fed, like we've been talking about most of the semester, conducts monetary policy, changes reserves, changes money supply, which influences interest rates, and can cause, obviously, I and C to shift, and the aggregate demand curve to move back and forth, up or down. And so here we have 5 reasons for shifts in the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so now let's move into the aggregate supply curve, AS. Okay, now the aggregate supply curve it's different than the supply curve for an individual good. Remember, the supply curve for an individual good was upward sloping, because as price went up, people were willing to supply more of the good, because they would get a higher price for it. And so we had an upward sloping supply curve for an individual good. The story is a little more complicated for the aggregate supply curve. And so what we're going to see here is that the aggregate supply curve, there's actually 2 of them. First off, there's a short-run aggregate supply curve that we're going to deal with here. And whenever you hear the word short run, I shouldn't say whenever, most of the time you hear the word short run, it means something's fixed, something's sticky. And so here we're going to have a short run aggregate supply curve, and later on we'll pull in the long run aggregate supply curve. But for the moment, we're going to assume in the short run that wages are sticky. And so we're going to look at an aggregate supply curve. It's upward sloping. So here we have real GDP again. We have the aggregate price level for final goods and services. And so we have an aggregate supply curve in the short run that looks like this. And so sometimes the text will just say SRAS, aggregate short run aggregate supply curve. And the explanation for it is upward sloping. Has to do with wages being sticky. And so here's the story. You know that profit of a firm equals its sales minus its costs. Okay? And sales are P times Q, you can think. Price times the quantity of the unit sold. And costs, a dominant factor in your costs are wages. And so what we're going to see here is we're going to see that if we increase the price level, for example, if we increase prices, so we could slide along this curve, we increase prices, and we see that wages are fixed and somewhat sticky in the short run, then this increase in price is going to translate to an increase in profit for businesses. So businesses are going to want to expand output when prices go up. And if prices go down, the opposite will happen. You'll slide down this aggregate supply curve. So that's one reason why when prices go down, economists are fearful, because you're going to slide down this aggregate supply curve. You're going to slide down in terms of real GDP also. Okay, so we're looking here at nominal wages. Nominal wages are not adjusted for inflation. They're basically the contract wage. So if you sign on to work for a company and the pay is $10 an hour, then that's your nominal wage. Or it's $30,000 a year, that is your nominal wage. These nominal wages, sometimes called contract wages, are very slow to change, especially in aggregate. They may change somewhat from individual to individual. But generally, firms are locked into that. And we'll have more to say about that shortly. But it is basically a fact. You can see it in the aggregate data. And let me show it to you. Let me show you. Get off this paper here, and I'll show you a picture from FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database in St. Louis. Here we have the Consumer Price Index in blue with the Great Recession. Now look, it starts in 2007. I'm zeroing in on 2007 through 2010. And we see the Consumer Price Index ramping up, coming down. It drops about 3%. And then comes back, it looks like, back to its trend to some degree. This drop is significant. If you look at the Consumer Price Index over many, many years, it rarely drops 3%. It may have a drop here or there, but it just continues to chug along with time and increase a long trend. So it's unusual. That happens when you go into a deep recession. We had unemployment of 10%, official unemployment of about 10% in that time period. And we also had, remember, U6, the unofficial unemployment rate, which includes all the the people underemployed and so on, marginally attached and so on. And so in that time period, we had a significant drop in economic activity. Now look what happened. Wages, despite the fact that unemployment went up and U6 was high, all we had was a break in the trend of wages. So this is employment cost and cost index, wages and salaries for private industry workers in red. And it goes up with a steeper slope until about mid-2008, and then it starts to flatten out just a bit, but it continues on its way. Now that's a nice example of sticky wages, at least in aggregate, and we have flexible prices. We have changing prices, which is what the foundation of this chapter is about. So now let's move on to the aggregate supply curve a little bit more in detail. Now back to the short run aggregate supply curve. Let's look at the shifters of aggregate supply. And so we have a couple of things that can shift aggregate supply. The first one being changes in commodity prices can cause shifts in the aggregate supply curve. And so those are input prices. Now keep in mind that commodity prices, these are not the prices that are measured by the CPI, not the CPI. As I tried to highlight earlier, that when we're looking at aggregate supply and aggregate demand, I said, look, we have the aggregate price level here for final goods and services, which is the same as saying it's the GPI, the GDP price deflator, because GDP measures the value of goods and service, final goods and services sold. So here we're using, we're always using prices of final goods and services. This is commodity prices, which are input prices. So when input prices go up, your supply curve is going to move up or to the left. Okay? And if commodity prices come down, like oil prices come down, you're going to have an aggregate supply curve that moves out. Okay, real GDP is on this axis. So oil could be a factor in there, or any other commodity price. So if you're, steel prices, agriculture prices go up, you're going to move in this direction to the left. And so another factor in here that's not mentioned in your text, but other people would look at it as your aggregate supply curve can move back and forth right or left because of weather too. So weather is in there. That's not mentioned in your text, but if you have a severe enough weather in the Northeast or somewhere, drought covering most of the country, you could have, or hurricane, for example, like Katrina, could have an impact on aggregate supply, on the overall aggregate supply curve. The third item is, now this is going to sound crazy, but changes in nominal wages. Okay? Now I just got done telling you, what happens when you change, when the aggregate price level changes. I just got done telling you that nominal wages are sticky, and so they are sticky. But here we're saying if, so put it in italicized there, if wages were to change, nominal wages to change, basically, nominal wages are in a sense kind of like commodity prices. They're an input price. So this is inputs, commodities like raw steel, iron ore is a commodity, oil is a commodity, and it's used as an input to the production process, and so is labor and the wages that we end up paying for that. So you can think of it as being similar. So we're saying if wages were to go up, and if they were higher, then the aggregate supply curve would move up to the left, and if they were lower, the aggregate supply curve would move down to the right. Okay, that's a little hard to get comfortable with, but it's analogous to the concept we did in the previous chapter where we talked about interest rates being fixed, and I said, look, interest rates are fixed in this chapter, but we can ask the question, what happens if rates were higher? What does that mean for investment? Well, it would mean investment's lower. Okay. Now, the fourth thing that can change this aggregate supply curve is productivity. So if you can increase productivity, innovations come in, they make things cheaper, we're more efficient at producing goods and services, you can bet your aggregate supply curve is going to shift in this direction. Economists love that. Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Fed, loved it when he got reports that productivity was increasing. Because notice what it does is it puts less pressure on prices to rise. So if you're in an inflation, you can prevent inflation by having an aggregate supply curve that constantly is moving out to the right because of increases in productivity. That's a really interesting concept, a neat concept. Now what we want to do is, this is short run. Remember, this is short run aggregate supply curve here that we're dealing with. Let's introduce the long run aggregate supply curve. In the long run aggregate supply curve, looks a lot like that money supply curve I showed you earlier. Real GDP here, and here we have the aggregate price level here. The long run aggregate supply curve looks like this. And so when prices change, you have an equilibrium here. When prices change and they drop, say, you end up at a new point here. No change in output. If you start at this point and prices go up, you're going to have an increase in prices. You're staying right at the same GDP level. No change in it. Now, how could that be? Well, the long run aggregate supply curve is when prices, all prices, commodity prices, the price of labor, which is wages, final goods and service prices, all of them are flexible. So if everything's flexible, all prices are flexible, then you're not going to have any change in real GDP if prices go up or down. It's just not going to happen. So you can superimpose a short-run aggregate supply curve on top, and the short-run aggregate supply curve says, look what happens, when we have stickiness, right? We have, remember, profit equals sales minus your costs, and your costs are driven a lot by wages, nominal wages, and this is P times Q. So if in the short run your costs are somewhat sticky, and prices go up, and we go up, we're running up along this aggregate supply curve in the short run. But if everything is flexible, profits remain constant. There's no effect, because what happens is your wages and your costs go up at the same the same rate as your sales are changing, so your profit margin doesn't change. So there's no incentive for firms to increase output because of an increase in price when everything's flexible. So you go up the aggregate supply curve, the long-run aggregate supply curve. You're not on this short-run aggregate supply curve. So, what we think is, as economists, macroeconomists, is that sure, in the short run we have an aggregate supply curve that looks like this. Wages are sticky. I just showed you that. But in the long run, the economy adjusts. The problem is, how long does it take to get from this line to this line? How long does it take for wages to adjust, all prices to adjust, so that you're on this long-run aggregate supply curve? That's the big question. So keep in mind also that this level right here, this is sometimes labeled YP as your potential GDP. So this is nothing but, flip this axis. See, this is on the x-axis. Pretend it's on the y-axis here, and you put time here. Okay? So here you can think of the potential GDP over time. So over time, this long-run aggregate supply curve marches outward to the right. Assuming there's economic growth, this supply curve moves out in this direction over time. So it increases. So here it is. Here's real GDP on this axis. And here we have potential GDP here. And you have the business cycle. Over top of it, short-run deviations. Deviations here, they're accounted for by this short-run aggregate supply curve in part. I say in part because part of aggregate demand plays a role in this. But let's look at before we get into aggregate demand and relating aggregate supply and aggregate demand together, let's just look a little bit more closely at just the aggregate supply and how aggregate supply by itself and price changes can get us, and wage changes also can get us back into an equilibrium. So here's the graph. It's pretty cool based on what we've developed so far. Here's real GDP. Here is the aggregate price level. Here is our long-run aggregate supply curve. Call it YP, potential output, sometimes called Y star, so don't get P mixed up with plan, investment, or anything. It's not that. And so here we have our short-run aggregate supply curve. And as we start out with an equilibrium right there, 0.1. Now let's assume that we have an increase in the price level. Okay, prices increase. And when prices increase, we have wages that are sticky. And so what happens is, if we go from, let's say, this price level, P1, to P2. Okay, here's P2. Prices go up, right? We go out, and so prices go up. Firms are going to, overall in the economy, firms are going to produce more goods and services because their profits are going up. Because remember, profits, P times Q, is sales minus their costs, and we said wages are sticky in the short run. So prices are going up, profits are going up. Firms are willing to expand output, so they expand output. But notice what happens. We're beyond our potential. So we're beyond our potential. It's as though we're up here. We're beyond our long-run potential, YP. Here's time. Here's real GDP. And so what happens is when that, in the long run, this means that we have a high demand for employment. In other words, we have the costs are going to go up because the unemployment rate has dropped significantly, and so we're going to have excess demand, or in other words, to say it really, a shortage of labor, and the shortage of labor is eventually going to cause wages to go up. So wages are going to go up, and wages go up. We just talked about that. When wages go up, what happens to the aggregate supply curve? Oops. The aggregate supply curve moves to the left. And so you get a new short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, call it aggregate, so call it 2. Aggregate supply curve 2, call this aggregate supply curve 1. And so you move right here to a new equilibrium. And so in this graph down here, what happens is we end up moving to the long run. And so at these points I'm going to mark them with X's. At these points is where the short run equals the long run, which corresponds to these points right here. So the short run equals the long run, the short run equals the long run. So we can deviate and go above trend, above potential here, but it causes labor shortages and turns wages up, causes them to go up, causes short run aggregate supply curve to move to the left. And then the same thing happens in reverse. If for some reason we're out here, and so for some reason we're here and we have a drop in prices, we end up out here because wages are sticky, we end up dropping, right? And so when nominal wages are fixed, lower prices means that the firm is bearing these high costs. And so it's bearing high costs. Prices on this end are going down. Profits are going down. So firms are going to end up supplying less to the economy. Now, that's going to cause a surplus in labor. And so the surplus in labor means that wages are going to fall. And wages are going to fall, then it means the aggregate supply curve, the short run, moves out and to the right. And that'll happen. It'll eventually, I think I should have drew this a little further down. What you'll end up doing is you'll end up getting back on the long run aggregate supply curve. So if you're above trend or above potential, you'll move back because wages will increase. Nominal wages will increase and push us back. If we're below, wages will fall and cause us to snap back. So when you have very flexible prices of everything, all prices, commodity prices, labor prices, which are wages, and the prices of final goods and services, that can explain why we can stay on a long-run trend. So now we're ready to combine aggregate supply and aggregate demand in one graph, one model, to explain various outcomes with the economy. So here we have our standard real GDP aggregate price level graph, okay, and aggregate demand, and we have a short run, I'll call it SR, aggregate supply curve, equilibrium, 0.1. Okay, so this is aggregate demand 1, aggregate supply 1, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And what we're going to do is we're going to let's explore an increase in government expenditures. And an increase in government expenditures would move us from 81 to 82. Okay. Now the textbook talks about this as being an aggregate demand shock. So the government comes a shock, meaning it's a surprise to the economy, to people, and the government ramps up its spending. Okay. So now what you see is you see we move from 0.1 to 0.2 ultimately. And so what happens is prices are going up. So we know that supply is going up, because when prices go up, that implies that our profits are going up. As we have P times Q, the P is going up, price, so sales are increasing, minus costs, and we have a good portion of our costs being nominal wages, which are kind of sticky. So just a portion of them are sticky. So profits are going up, so businesses are willing to supply more output. Okay, now, so that kind of all makes sense. And you could stop right there, and I'd be happy with your understanding of how this works. But there's another thing going on here that we should recognize, and I'm going to cover it right now. You can fast forward if you want, but here's the couple of things that are going on. We just kind of smashed everything in here into one explanation that's going on to go from point 1 to point 2. But there's really, and you kind of already know this, there's really two components to this. If we keep prices fixed like we did in the last chapter, then really what you have is you initially have this increase in GDP. Look at this increase in GDP. It's very, very big if you keep prices fixed, right? But they're not here. But if suppose they were, then your real GDP would increase dramatically. So what's happening is there is a positive effect of prices going on here. And we've captured that run up the aggregate supply curve. But there's you can look at it as the sum of this component, and then there's a component right here that we have to account for. Okay? And so that component can be thought of as this. Look, when G goes up and we have an increase in aggregate demand, and we have prices going up, we know that when prices go up, it has a negative impact on from a wealth perspective and from an interest rate perspective. It means interest rates are going to go up. So what we can say is, look, when prices go up, money demand goes up because we need more money to transact business. You remember this relationship? I'll draw it right here. We had a fixed money supply, we had interest rate R, we had the quantity of money on this side, we had money demand, and we said that money demand is related is a function of the price level. If prices go up, we need to hold more money to transact business, and for convenience purposes, that's going to drive interest rates up. So when money demand goes up, R goes up, interest rates go up. When interest rates go up, autonomous consumption can go down. You know, for example, if consumers borrow to buy consumer durables, and then also investment goes down, like specifically IP investment, planned investment goes down. So that causes us to go up the aggregate demand curve and back, up and back, till we have an equilibrium. So it's all this is being net out, which is why I told you at the beginning, this aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve shows the circular, not the flow, but the circular relationship between GDP and prices. There's feedback effects that we should consider. But I'm happy if you simply know that, look, when government increases its G, government expenditures, and aggregate demand shifts out, you're going to run up the aggregate supply curve, you're going to have higher prices, and you're going to have higher real GDP. I'm happy with you knowing it just there. Okay, now, let's look at what happens if we have an aggregate demand shock that's negative. In other words, the government, let's just say the government reduces its amount of the government expenditures. So we're going to here draw it nice and big. So remember, aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. And here we have a short run aggregate supply curve. Call it 1 and 1. We're at point 1 where we're starting. And now the government decides to cut G. G comes down. we have a drop in aggregate demand to aggregate demand 2. And, the netting effect here is you're going to go sliding down this aggregate supply curve, and you're going to be at point 2. Okay, so it's almost operationally, mechanically, like we saw, in the very early chapters of this course with the supply and demand for a basic good. But there's a lot more underneath it, though. But in any case, the price level falls. Sales are falling. Wages are sticky. So what we have is profits falling and firms producing less, so output drops. Okay, so output is dropping because of that. Okay, but we need to think about the feedback effects. We've just ignored the feedback effects. So let's address those feedback effects. Had the price level been fixed, we would have moved from point 1 to point, I'll call this 1A, an intermediate step. We would have went to this point, and we would have went to this point with fixed prices, but we have to come down, so we have to address now what's happened here. What's happened here is prices have come down, which implies money demand has dropped, which implies R has dropped, which implies that autonomous consumption goes up and IP goes up and planned investment increases. Or you can think of it consistently that there's a positive wealth effect. So when prices go down, the value of the wealth that you hold in bank accounts and the value of your house, it just increases on a relative basis, on a real basis is what's going on. So you end up having this wealth effect also. And so when prices drop, we all become wealthier, provided we have some wealth that we've had saved up somewhere. And so that's going to cause our aggregate demand curve to shift out. Shift along the aggregate demand curve, because we're changing prices. When you change price, you're moving along this curve. Okay. So there we have it. We have two different ways of moving the aggregate demand curve. Positively, meaning there's a positive shock, an increase in government expenditures, or a decrease in government expenditures, what your textbook is calling a negative aggregate demand shock. A nice example of a negative aggregate demand shock is when went into the Great Depression in the 1930s, when the stock market fell and investment fell off dramatically and consumption fell off dramatically. So C and I fell off. So aggregate demand dropped significantly in in somewhat surprising fashion, moved down, and so that was the perfect example of an aggregate demand shock, a big one. There's the flip side is the positive aggregate demand shock would have been World War II. So when World War II came along, expenditures, this G went up and ramped up dramatically. I mean, huge increases in government expenditures to fight the war caused aggregate demand to shift up, and that's ultimately what pulled us out of the Great Depression and the slow growth that came out of that time period. So now what we want to do is, we just looked at aggregate demand shocks. Let's look at aggregate supply shocks. They're a little more, they're somewhat more interesting, and there's implications to them that we should look at. So let's look at a negative aggregate supply shock. So real GDP, price, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply. Here we are, point 1, and so we're going to have a negative aggregate demand shock. Ooh, so what would that be an example of? Well, that would be oil going up, for example. So we have a short run aggregate supply 1, short run aggregate supply 2. So what happens is the price of oil goes up, and oil is an input. And so you can think of it as, at each and every level. Let me put this in red. Do I have red here? You can think of this at each and every level of production, right? At this level of production, prices are going to go up because the input costs went up. So that's the way to think of it, how that aggregate supply curve shifts up from that perspective, it shifts up to the left. But from a production point of view and costs, just plant yourself somewhere here, a given level of production, and realize that prices go up. Firms are not going to supply unless they raise their prices. So we go from point 1, we slide up the aggregate demand curve to point 2. Okay, now that's basically all we need to know per se, but there's obviously, as I talked about earlier, there's other things going on here, just so that you get a little idea about what's going on underneath here. If we keep the price level fixed like we did in the last chapter, then we can break this up into this change into two components. We have this large change here, right, and that's the shift, the aggregate supply curve, but without any price changes. Okay, now there's prices are rising, and it has two effects here, and so we need to disentangle what those two effects are. Here, it's not hard to see that if prices go up as a result of this oil shock, prices go up, then profits are going to go up, right? And firms are going to produce more output given that, and so that's not hard to see. Now, prices are going up here, and we know so we know that's not good. Prices are going up from a demand point of view because what's happening is there's a negative wealth effect, and also prices go up, then we have that implies money demand is going up, which means interest rates are going to go up, which means autonomous consumption is going to go down, planned investment goes down, and then we're moving up the aggregate demand curve because of price changes. Okay, so that's an oil shock. That is the worst of all of these shocks that I'm showing you. When we have aggregate demand going up or down, that's one thing. We're going to show aggregate supply going off to the right here. That's another thing. But this, a leftward move in the aggregate supply curve, is what's called stagflation. Stagnant economy, in other words, real GDP drops and prices go up. That is a recession with inflation built into it. And that's a nasty event. That's what happened in the 1970s. We had oil prices going up. We had economic turmoil. Prices had went up in the overall economy, and we had drops in GDP. We had numerous recessions in that time period, and that it's a hard thing to fight, as we'll see later on when we get to fiscal policy and monetary policy. Digging our way out of this problem is hard. Getting her out of this problem is hard. Now, so I'll leave it at that, and we'll pick up on that thought later on in the next chapter. Now, let's look at an increase in aggregate supply, which is a friendly event for us, a nice event. So here we have prices, we have aggregate demand, we have aggregate supply, short run. We have our equilibrium of 0.1. Now, aggregate supply curve shifts out. Okay, so aggregate supply curve shifts out. If we had prices fixed, we'd be going all the way up to this point here, but we only go out to 0.2. So we slide down the aggregate demand curve. And so before we go further, let's ask ourselves, why would this move out? Well, this is an example of a productivity, a positive productivity shock is what economists would call it. So, some new method of doing something. It could be the PCs coming out, computers coming out a while back. It could be iPhone applications, apps for phones. And the textbook talks about how Walmart came into play and had its computerized distribution system that revolutionized retail. All of those things can have impacts on productivity. Now, when you have productivity shocks, positive ones, you're not going to have big, I'm kind of exaggerating what's going on here, so it'll be smaller, but I'm going to exaggerate it in any case so you can see what's going on. Okay, so this is increases in productivity, and so you see when there's increases in productivity, prices fall and output goes up. That's exactly what economists like to see, and people who track the economy, they want to see that productivity increases. Now, what's going on? Well, from here to here to here, we see prices going down, and when prices go down, we have a positive wealth effect, so sliding down the aggregate demand curve. There is less demand for money, so interest rates fall, and autonomous consumption increases, and planned investment goes up. Okay? So we got wealth up there. I'll just say wealth effect going because of lower prices. And then there's money demand going down because prices have gone down, which means R is going down, which means A is going up, autonomous consumption, and planned investment is going up. So we move down. But don't forget, there is also a counteraction here, a counter effect. And that counter effect, let me see if I'll put it up here. That counter effect is prices have fallen, and so when prices fall, profits are going to fall, so profits fall off, and so firms are less willing to supply, so they're moving down this aggregate supply curve. And there you have it, and we end up at point 2. Now let's bring in the long-run aggregate supply curve. We pretty much haven't paid attention to it for a while. And the reason why we're doing that is, again, I'm going back to the idea that we have business cycles. We have a long-run potential GDP. And long before we had good macroeconomic understanding, the economy would go into booms and busts, and it would self-correct. We haven't really addressed that in these graphs so far, in these concepts, because look, I'm showing you an increase in aggregate supply. Maybe that's not the best one. I could show you, for example, the increase in decrease in aggregate demand, leaving us with less real GDP. How can the economy get back to its original long-run equilibrium if you assume that, look, this was basically long-run potential GDP, right, or long-run aggregate supply curve, right, whereas full employment at this point of level of GDP. How does it get back to here? Because when we're in a recession, somehow the economy snapped back, and that's where the long-run aggregate supply curve comes into play. So let's look at an example. Real GDP, price level. Here we have the long-run aggregate supply curve. So the prices are perfectly flexible. Everything is flexible in the long run. And so we have a aggregate demand curve, 1. We have a short-run aggregate supply curve, 1. We have equilibrium right here at point 1. Okay, start out there. So there we are at full potential GDP, which is, think of it as full employment GDP. And let's assume that the economy gets hit with a negative demand shock, like the one we talked about in the Great Depression. So aggregate demand goes from point 1 to point 2. And as I showed you earlier, that would mean a slide down this aggregate supply curve to point 2. Okay, and so you had the whole story as to what we talked about earlier about how we got there. But now what we want to do is introduce the idea of how do we get back to this long-run aggregate supply curve? How do we get back to our long-run potential? How do we get back to this potential? Well, what we see is when prices drop, okay, when you have a fall in prices, and you have a reduction in GDP, then what's going to happen is you're going to see nominal wages fall. And when nominal wages fall, it's going to push the short-run aggregate supply curve out. So when we fall below potential, we basically get unemployment here. And unemployment is going to cause wages to drop. And when wages drop, we end up coming down to 0.3, and we're back to our long-run equilibrium, but we're at a lower price level. So prices have gone from P1 now to P3, let's call it. And so there we are back into equilibrium. Why? Because in the long run, wages can drop. Remember, wages are sticky in the short run. In the long run, they can drop. And they drop because there's unemployment. So this is sometimes called a recessionary gap, because we're in a recession here. So there's unemployment. It's a recessionary gap. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to look at what happens when we have an increase in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand shock from the positive side, like World War II is an example, and there's lots of other examples, but not to that magnitude. So here we have long-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand 1, short run 1. We start off right here at equilibrium. Aggregate demand jumps up. Okay, so we go from 0.1 to 0.2. That's what we just talked about in the middle of this video. And here we have YP, or what's called full employment GDP. And we get here, we have what's called, we're beyond our potential. So we're up here, we're beyond our potential in GDP. That's what's called an inflationary gap. The economy is in a strong boom, and so when you have an inflationary gap, you're really employers are very much trying to get people who are, maybe marginally attached to working. Remember those marginal attached workers, the workers that were underemployed because they were working part-time because of the economy? Well, they're going to eventually get pulled into employment and start working. And in order for that to happen, firms are going to have to raise their wages. They raise their wages, it shifts the aggregate supply curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve, out to the left. And we end up at 0.3. So we end up with higher prices, and we get inflation as a result of that. So when you end up in an inflationary gap, obviously, just from the terminology, you can see that it makes sense that prices end up going higher as a result. And so there you have it. There you have the complete story for the economy rebounding on its own without any intervention. So there you have it, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. Now, there's one more thing I want to get to, and that just summarizes what's happened in this entire video. And we go back to what I said earlier at the very beginning of the video. I said, look, changes in prices will end up showing changes, will impact changes in GDP, and that changes in GDP will impact changes in prices. That circular relationship between the two variables here. So let's look at that a little more closely to see how that went. Well, we saw that in the short run, when prices changed, it affected GDP, right, through our aggregate demand curve. Remember, our aggregate demand curve, we had a couple of things go on. We had a wealth effect, So when prices change, prices went up, for example, we're less wealthy because our value of our savings have declined on a relative basis. So you have the wealth effect. And if prices go down, we're more wealthy because we have the value that we have in our bank accounts is now worth more, can go further. And we also have, when prices change, we have changes in money demand, which changes interest rates. So when prices go up, we need more money to hold more money for transaction purposes in our bank accounts and in our pockets, in our cash registers. And that increase in money demand causes interest rates to go up. Okay, so if prices go up, money demand goes up, interest rates go up, and that means we'll have R going down, or no, I'm sorry, we'll have autonomous expenditures going down, consumption expenditures going down, and planned investment going down. Okay, so if prices drop, it's the other way around. So we'll have a drop in money demand, a drop in interest rates, and an increase in these two variables, consumption and investment. So therefore, we saw that in the short run, we saw that changes in prices had an impact in GDP. We also saw at the very end that in the long run, with the aggregate supply curve, we saw that when we were out of equilibrium, away from long-run potential, away from full employment GDP, then we had inflationary and recessionary gaps. And those gaps caused changes in wages in the long run, caused changes in wages, and those changes in wages caused the long-run aggregate supply curve to shift back and forth. And that shift back and forth caused us changes in GDP, ended up causing changes in prices. So there we have it. The whole circular relationship.